So over the last 2 videos, we've been working in a project that I've also been featuring in some of my shorts. And on one of those shorts, I got asked the question how I made the bass line for this particular track. It has changed a little bit, but it's still very interesting, so that's what we're going to have a look at today. So this is the project, I think you'll all be familiar with it, so I'm just going to go to the back here where the kick and bass is on its own, and we'll loop this part so that we can listen to it. And you can hear that we have this 2-bar pattern that repeats. And as you can see, once we open up the group, it is made out of 4 layers. The part that makes it so that it repeats every 2 beats is actually this first bass line over here. This is a groovy pattern based on this kind of like step idea, which seems like it duplicates in that the second part is basically the first part, but this last beat of it is removed. And as you can see, I'm using velocity in here because in the patch I use velocity for volume control. The second part of it are all of the accent layers, and that is what I want to focus on today, because that is going to be the most unique part of this bass line. The reason for that is this is just my standard bass patch. Together with the kick, it sounds like this. Now this is the patch over here. It starts off with a serum. And as you can see, this is just my standard bass patch from Projector Psytrance Essentials Volume 3. This is one of the presets in the pack. I use it all the time now. It's my main bass patch for a while. You can see it over here, the sub shifter auto sub control. And that's very technical. That's because it is. There's a lot that goes into this bass patch that makes it work. It's very different from your standard kind of bassline patch in the way that you use it and the way that you process it. The reason for that is this is a wavetable bassline. And what that means is that all of the processing is captured in the wavetable. So all of the phase shifting that you would normally do with multiband processing is now in the wavetable, so you don't have to worry about that anymore. In fact, if you don't cause any major phase shift on this bassline, it is so clean out of the patch that you don't have to do any resampling for this patch, which means that I can keep it in MIDI and just render the bassline like this and it will still be clean. Now you might not know exactly what that means, so I have 2 reference videos for you that you can watch on that topic. One is for general cleanliness and how to clean up your bassline. It's a little bit old, but the information is still very good. And the other one is on using waveform analysis to see if there's issues with your bassline. Now back in the wavetable bassline, I can actually choose which style of processing that I want. If you look at the wavetable over here, you can see there's many frames. And if I move around, you can see that it goes from very little processing all the way up to more phase shift, more and more, until you get to something that looks like this. I've mapped the wavetable position to this phasing parameter over here, so I can dial in the amount of processing that I want on my bassline in real time right in here. I have some other controls over here as well. This closer relates to how this envelope works on top of the filter cutoff. This is the main envelope for the filter cutoff, which I tie to an LFO so that I can tie it to the time here. This means that this bass patch will work in any BPM and it will always have the same kind of curvature to it. The same is true for these other LFOs, which I also use for various controls. This is to control the level of the sub bass, which I have separated to its own oscillator. You can see that it's completely flat now because there's another LFO over here, which controls this wavetable position here. Inside of this wavetable, you can see we just have 2 frames. We have a lower flat frame over here, which is silence. And then we have our full sine wave over here, which is fully up. And in this case, we're just using the crossfade to morph between them. What that means is that I have 2 separate controls of the volume. As you can see, this is a quarter note, so it's a beat long. What this LFO does is it makes sure that when the kick is playing, the sub bass isn't playing. So the kick will play in the first half over here, and the sub bass will only be playing in the second half over here. And this is just a general control for each note. As you can see, it's set to 16 notes, so this is controlling an individual note, and it's set to envelope mode as well. So this just makes sure that the sub bass comes in a little bit later, and then it closes down at the end of the note so the volume goes all the way down. We also have volume control for our main oscillator over here. And then finally we have another volume control over here, which is tied to this X-shaper distortion over here. This is a custom shape where in the shape A, what I've done is I have taken this graph and just set it all the way down, which causes this graph to produce silence. As you can see, there's a silence line over here. And then we're using the mix as our volume control. There's a few other key features in here. For example, the sub-tightener allows you to control the shape of this LFO over here, the starting position of this kind of ramping up part over here mainly. And then we have this note length over here, which allows you to dial in exactly what it sounds like, the length of the note that you want to play. And inside of the MIDI pattern, as you can see, we have an automation to play certain notes as an 8th note as opposed to a 16th note. So they just sound a little bit more open and sustained. So that is basically the patch. I go in a lot more detail in another video on it as well, where I recreate it from scratch as well so that you can follow along. And of course, if you want to spend an afternoon learning much more about kick and bass design, make sure that you check out my ultimate guide to kick and bass. It is over 3 hours long though, so you're going to need to have a free afternoon as I said. But in that video, I obviously go in the most amount of detail possible, and I explain every minute thing that you need to know about kick and bass design in order to make sure that your kick and bass sounds the best it can be. Now in terms of the processing, I start off with a stereo spread. This allows me to add a little bit of stereo width to the area between 300 Hz and 15 kHz. We are, however, using the focus over here, which makes the effect focused a little bit more towards the higher frequencies of that area. It is kind of skewing the effect more to the higher frequencies as opposed to the lowest frequencies over here. And we're using a little bit of saturation on there, as well as a lot of spread. That is just going to generate the stereo width for us. Because up until this point, our bass is completely mono, and I like a little bit of stereo play on my bass line. So without the effect, it sounds like this. And with it, it sounds like this. You can hear that it just adds a nice little bit of width there. It's nothing crazy. And you hear that it also changes the texture and the characteristics of the bassline slightly, just like a slight tone change to it as well. That is because, of course, this is filtered, so this is causing a little bit of phase shift. But this phase shift doesn't cause too big of an effect on our bassline because we have set this to such a high frequency. The next plugin is Transgressor. This is a very nice plugin for click removal. It separates up the signal into the transient part and the sustain part and allows you to mix between them and include them differently. In this part, the release control is very important. And here you can hear the difference. So this is without it. And with it. Just the bass line is a little bit tighter and a little bit deeper, and overall I think it's a very nice sound. Then the next 4 effects, I should really combine them all into one, because what we essentially have is we have an EQ to accentuate and deaccentuate certain frequencies here. Then we saturate a little bit. With these 2 plugins over here, we have the Black Box Analog Design over here. And then we have the Shadow Hills Mastering Compressor, which I also like for a little bit of saturation. Both of them have a nice box tone and both of them have a nice saturation capability as well. I also use a little bit of air in this one. Then finally, after we have that saturation, we have another EQ to kind of shape that saturation into place. What you'll notice with both of them is that I'm also low passing them. This makes sure that the click stays under control and it doesn't become too sharp. But generally speaking, in the mixing stage, I'll tackle the kick and bass a lot more when it comes to the processing. Mainly the kind of tonal shaping that you see over here with this kind of EQ, I tend to do that again when I do the final mix. So this is not going to be the final sound of the bass line in the final master. But for now, you can hear what kind of impact this has on the tone. And then with it, it sounds like this. So you can hear some small changes, but definitely makes this bass sound a little bit better. But as I said, these kind of small changes are still subject to change in the final mix. So now let's have a look at the layers. We start off with this one over here, which is going to add just a little bit to the first 8th note of the pattern. So we have this 8th note over here in the first beat on the offbeat. And this is just going to add some extra nice grittiness to it and some extra stereo width as well. You can hear a very zappy kind of sound, and that is because we're using the ICANN kick wavetable over here in combination with a 24 dB per octave filter. So that's going to do some pretty sharp filtering. You can see over here, again, I'm using the LFO to control the filter cutoff, and I've set it to 1/8 node. In terms of processing, we have some tube distortion, which I'm slightly modulating as well. We have the compressor over here set to multiband mode for some extra phasing. And then we have some hyper and dimension to generate some stereo width. I'm filtering out all of the low frequencies over here, as well as some of the higher frequencies. And I'm mainly focusing it on the mid-range here around 1K. Then we use M stereo spread again to generate stereo width. In this case, we're using only the spread option over here. We're using a few more bands and no focus whatsoever. So the effect is going to be on the whole frequency spectrum equally. I then use MSAT to actually completely mute the mono component, which means that this is only going to play in the sides, meaning that this is going to be a pure stereo layer. And then finally, we have some dimension expander here to just add some extra dimension to it. And you can hear that all of this just adds a nice bit of stereo width to that first offbeat note. This next layer is kind of like the response to this one over here. This happens on the first offbeat of the bar, whereas this one happens on the third offbeat of the bar. And as you can see over here, we're also using a 16th note followed by an 8th note. So that's the same that this is over here, meaning that we have kind of like a call and response going on in the pattern as well as with the sound design. Speaking of the sound design, we have a basic saw wave going through a 12 dB per octave filter over here. Again, LFO1 is used for filter cutoff control. This time we have a little bit more of a plucky shape, it just dives down a little bit quicker. The other shapes have all been looking somewhat like this, where you kind of have two components to it. Some were a little bit more like this, maybe a little bit lower, something like this. But for this one, this is the shape that we went with, so it's a lot more plucky. And you can see here we have 16 notes. In terms of processing, it is again very basic. We use hyper and dimension to generate some stereo width. We have the multiband compressor over here, but this multiband compressor was introducing a little bit too much of the high frequencies, so I decided to tame it slightly with this 6 dB per octave filter over here. Now the sound itself is pretty quiet, partially because we are again filtering out a lot of the frequencies. I am lowering the volume a little bit on this one. I am again stereonizing the sound, as you can see, quite hard on this one. We're having very hard saturation and very hard spread here, but this is not going to be a pure stereo layer, so we're not removing the mono component here. What we are doing is a little bit of sidechaining here. As you can see, it is again very slight. We just want to add a little bit of a bumping effect, but we don't want these first notes to go away completely. And the reason that we can do that is of course because we're filtering out all of those lower frequencies, meaning that there's no sub bass in the way of our main bass line over here, which is providing all of the sub bass that we need together with the kick. Then finally, again, dimension expander, just to add some width to it as well as some just roomy feeling to it. I like to use these on bass lines when I want the reverb effect, but I don't want any tail of it. Then I set the size to 0 and then you don't get any tail. It stops immediately when the bass line itself stops playing as well. So again, that just prevents muddiness in the mix. You can use some reverb as well if you want to, but you need to be a lot more careful with it and maybe only use early reflections. And again, the reason why we can do that is because we're filtering out a lot of the lower frequencies and also a lot of the higher frequencies, which we also don't want to make messy because the transient of our main bass line also needs to shine through a lot, because that is the indication of where the rhythm of the track is going to be. So you can imagine if we have a lot of high frequency reverb, that is going to smooth that out, and the transient of the bass line has a harder time cutting through the mix. So the second layer is going to sound like this. As you can tell, it's very quiet, so you might not be able to hear what it plays. I'll also play it again, and then this time in the edit, I'll turn up the volume so that you can hear it properly. And together with the other two bass lines, it's going to sound like this. Again, you can hopefully hear how that just adds a little bit of extra groove to that part of the bass line, and that there's this call response going on between the first layer over here and the second layer over here. The final layer that we have is this kind of sine plug here. It's this low kind of thumpy sound like this. Now you could do this by cleverly manipulating a kick drum, removing its transient and only using like the tail part of it. But the way that I did it is I just designed kind of like something very similar to a kick, but with far less pitch bend than you would normally have for a kick drum. And as you can see, I'm using the analog sine dB over here. So we have some upper harmonics in here that we're morphing through, which is done with the wavetable position over here. And then we're also controlling the level. So this LFO is basically controlling everything here. You can see we don't have any effects over here. What we are doing is slightly altering how the modulation curve works. This just makes it so that the pitch goes down a little bit quicker than this modulation is showing, and that the volume stays open for much longer than that this modulation is showing here. In terms of EQing, this is what I have. I'm mainly focusing towards this one lower peak over here and boosting up this little bit as well so that we get some of that click back that we're losing from this bit. Without it, you can hear it sounds like this. And with it, it sounds like this. So you can hear how it focuses a little bit more towards the sub-bass region. Now, because we're using such a resonant peak over here, it's going to become a little bit longer than we want. So you can see we're using LFO tool to just cut it off so that it doesn't interfere with this bass note over here. You can exactly see this kind of tail that we're cutting off here, and we can see that it basically looks like a very muffled kick in terms of its waveform. Now in terms of group processing, I have my filter rack, which I use to do filter transitions and then volume control over here. I have this rack over here, which is used also for transitions. This just turns on and off sometimes. And as you can see, it's just filtering out the mid-range and then distorting that. And then I'm gain staging over here as well. Then finally, we're using this stereo spread over here, which we're using to saturate the side signal a little bit more. This just blends the side signal all together a little bit once they all combine. So again, this is a very small detail and is maybe something that I'll have to tweak again later in the mix. Without it, it sounds like this. And with it, it sounds like this. So that's it. That's everything that there is to this patch. As I said before, this first patch is available in the preset pack Psytrance Essentials Volume 3 on my Gumroad page. You'll find a link to that in the description. But for the other 3, I'm going to upload those on the Patreon page. So if you're a patron, you can just immediately grab the Serum presets and use them in your own tracks. So that's going to be it for today. I hope that you guys enjoyed it. If you want to support the channel, make sure that you watch some more of my content. There will be 2 videos up on the screen right now. One is the latest tutorial and the other one is recommended to you by YouTube, so YouTube will think that you'll enjoy that one. So just choose one of them and enjoy it, and I hope to see you in the next one. Bye bye.